President Trump signed a memorandum earlier this afternoon addressing China's trade policies and practices. Mr. Trump announced a probe that will look into alleged Chinese violations of U.S. trade. He also accused the country of stealing American intellectual property. Here's what he said earlier.
Today, I'm directing the United States Trade Representative to examine China's policies, practices, and actions with regard to the forced transfers of American technology and the theft of American intellectual property. As President of the United States, it's my duty and responsibility to protect the American workers, technology, and industry from unfair and abusive actions. We will stand up to any country that unlawfully forces American companies to transfer their valuable technology as a condition of market access. We will combat the counterfeiting and piracy that destroys American jobs. We will enforce the rules of fair and reciprocal trade that form the foundation of responsible commerce. And we will protect forgotten Americans who have been left behind by a global trade system that has failed to look, and I mean look, out for their interests. They have not been looking out at all.
I want to bring in Scott Kennedy, a China expert for the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He joins me from the CSIS headquarters in Washington. So, Scott, first, I want to get to the fact that this was part of President Trump's campaign promise, that he wanted to give American workers a fair shake when it came to trade policy. He said before he signed that memorandum, quote, "We will defend our workers and protect the innovations that power our majestic country." What other details do we know about this memo at this point and what it means?
Well, I mean, we know that for many years, and as we saw during the campaign in the first few months, that the President Trump has been frustrated in our economic relationship with China. That actually President Obama and others have as well. But he was going to take a new tact and apply more unilateral pressure on China. We have a $650 billion trading relationship, a couple $100 billion in investment in both directions. And although many Americans, consumers and workers, benefit from this relationship, 2.6 million American workers have jobs based on this relationship, it is increasingly unfair, and it affects both companies as well as workers whose jobs are displaced. And intellectual property theft, which is what today's executive order is about, is a key part of the problem that needs to be addressed to make the relationship much more balanced than it currently is.
Okay, so this memo launches a probe into these practices. Notably, a Chinese newspaper, China Daily, an English paper basically owned by the Chinese government, warned today that this memo and this probe could trigger a trade war and that this probe would, quote, poison relationships. Is this heading toward a trade war? And what could China do to retaliate?
Sure. Well, I don't think we're going to see a trade war break out anytime in the next several weeks. The process that now unfolds requires the U.S. Trade Representative, Ambassador Lighthizer, to carry out an investigation which could go on for a few months. And then based on what he finds, assuming he found China to be in violation of its commitments globally or with the United States, to then engage in negotiations with China. And only if those negotiations were to fail would the U.S. then consider unilateral actions based on other American laws or take a case to the WTO. And it'd be at that point that we would be looking at some sort of Chinese retaliation. And that gets us toward the fourth quarter of this year, most likely, rather than anything that's going to happen right now.
So what you're saying is if the negotiations fail, the U.S. might then talk about things like sanctions and tariffs, and that could affect consumers, but that's down the line. Tell us more, if you would, Scott, about China's trade practices. The president has accused Beijing of stealing U.S. industrial secrets. What evidence do we have of that, and is that unique to China?
Sure. Well, I mean, I would say first it's important that broadly the relationship has been mutually beneficial, and lots of Americans, workers and companies benefit. But yes, IP theft has been a problem for a long time. Most of the software that is installed on computers in China is pirated. Many of the goods and products sold in Chinese stores, and increasingly industrial designs, patents, the Chinese are able to get through cyber means or others. And this is a big problem because now China is not just an assembler or a manufacturer. They want to be a designer. They want to move into high value added. And of course, that's exactly where the U.S. sits as a world leader in innovation. And so companies that do business with China, that invest in China, or even those that don't, but face these threats from Chinese hackers or others, this is costing the United States companies and workers lots of opportunities, and so it's something that has been growing in size, even though the exact form is changed over time.
Does that mean that these moves by the president will be supported by the American business community at large?
I think the business community is going to be torn. Obviously, there's no one wants the theft of their IP, but lots of American companies are doing fine, thank you very much, with their business in China in terms of their sales, and particularly relative to the sluggish markets elsewhere. And so there are some who feel concerned and want action, but they'd like it to be done more quietly and via the WTO. And then there's others who say, bring it on, that they want a much more aggressive White House engagement of China on these issues and penalties if China doesn't change its practices.
Let's look at the larger macro geopolitical point of view. China's cooperation in enforcing those new UN sanctions against North Korea, as you know, Scott, critical.
Yes.
How might that be affected by this announcement?
I think this announcement in and of itself isn't that important to what China is doing vis-a-vis North Korea. They are going to continue their broad approach, which is to be pulled, dragging and screaming to put more pressure on North Korea because they don't want destabilized Korean Peninsula and they don't want war. But they are, it would take not only this step, but move towards sanctions and perhaps other things that the administration could do on trade or economic issues for China to fundamentally change its approach to the Korean Peninsula.
But
so
they're
I think
threatening to do so through their state newspaper. Quote, Trump risks making the serious mistake of splitting up the international coalition that is the means to resolve the issue peacefully. Is it possible, Scott, that the U.S. is using this trade probe as a bargaining chip in the North Korea issue to get China to really enforce those sanctions? And could that backfire?
Yeah, well, I think 10 days ago when the U.S. was first getting ready to announce the investigation and held off, that was done apparently because there were negotiations ongoing at the UN that day about the North Korean sanctions and so the U.S. held off. But I think what we're seeing is basically a separation of these two issues, that the White House isn't willing to just simply wait for a resolution of the North Korean crisis and give China a total free pass on trade. So I do think we're going to see an upping of the American pressure on trade regardless of what happens on the Korean Peninsula.
Scott Kennedy, China expert for the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Scott, thanks a lot.
Happy to talk to you.